All right, so our next topic in these mini lecture videos here is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We're just following right along with the PowerPoint lecture. And so this is really dealing with slavery in these newer Western territories. So while everybody's arguing about the Fugitive Slave Act and they're constantly dealing with this issue of escaped slaves, many Americans are still simply trying to ignore the institution and the fight over its existence. A lot of Northern people are still kind of like, slavery's horrible. We don't really want to be drawn into it. But with the passage of the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Acts, it had quelled fears of disunion and a strong, prosperous national economy. It starts to distract people from slavery, but it also starts bringing this issue of slavery into northern streets. At the same time, America is looking to continue expanding. They're still trying to move westward. So I know we're backtracking and moving around in time period a lot, but really what's going on here is by the mid-1850s, we're still dealing with that issue of westward expansion. That's really what the issue of slavery is all about. And as a little keynote here, when you're dealing with your signature assignments, it's something you want to address in the introduction, is this issue of it's not so much slavery where it's already in existence that puts pressure on America. It's how do you deal with slavery moving west? And so America is considering strongly, they want to move out. They're heavily expansionist. They're trying to get into Latin America and the Caribbean. They want to expand and purchase Alaska. They're trying to do all these different things. But every time they do that, they are ultimately going to be stopped from expanding because if you go and pick up Cuba, let's say, Cuba's got 300,000 slaves. It's automatically a slave state. If you go and get Alaska or Hawaii, well, those are free territories. They have been since 1807 under English law. There's no slaves there. They're automatically going to come in as free states. And so it's just going to put more pressure on the U.S. In 1852's election, you have the Whigs are starting to peter out, and the Democrats are also sort of split on this issue of slavery. But they both put forward moderate candidates. They're trying to get everybody to calm down because this issue of slavery after the Compromise of 1850, people are all riled up. And so the Whigs are going to select General Winfield Scott. He was very famous in terms of mapping the American West. He's actually famous for correcting that mistaken map that Stephen Long had published back in 1823. The Democrats are going to select a guy named Franklin Pierce. He pushes this message of expand, expand, expand at any cost. But both candidates step forward and go, we vow not to mess with the Compromise of 1850. We're not going to touch that. We're not dealing with slavery anymore. We're really both about expansion and moving. Now, Franklin Pierce wins the election pretty easily. He gets over 50% of the national vote. But this election, what it really means politically is the end of the Whig Party. Scott is going to align heavily with anti-slavery ideals, and he loses the support of the South. And as far as the South is concerned, they're done with the Whigs. And so without that support, the Whig Party is going to go down this slow road of collapse and cease to exist in the United States. That's going to leave a vacuum, and there's a major political party that will rise up, and that is our modern-day Republican Party. We'll get to that when we start dealing with our guy Abraham Lincoln. So, moving forward, in the midst of all this, we have the passage of something known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. With westward expansion being the real big issue, Stephen Douglas, that guy who was part of the Compromise of 1850, he's an Illinois Democrat, and he's associated with something known as the Young America Movement. He feels that we've acquired all these territories to the west. It doesn't look like we can really expand anywhere else. So when it comes to westward expansion, a message that everybody can kind of get behind, whether you're anti-slavery or pro-slavery, he says what we ought to do is just start really developing these western territories. There's this big middle section of the country nobody really has moved into yet. And so when you look at this region of the nation, the Kansas and Platte River valleys are really fertile for agriculture. And this leads a lot of American farmers to want to move into that territory and start trying to grow crops. It's a great state. Those are both still to this day great areas for crop agriculture. Now, the U.S. needs to develop treaties with the local Native American groups living in those regions. Excuse me. Just allergies, I promise. In particular, the U.S. at this point is really looking to try to build out the Transcontinental Railroad, and they want to run it right through that territory of the Kansas and Platte River valleys. Now, Douglas is having a hard time getting people in Congress to go along with his idea. Particularly, the Southern Democrats, they all want to build a different transcontinental railroad. They want to draw up a plan for one that runs from the American South all the way out to the West Coast into Southern California, right here through Texas and New Mexico. So Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois, needs Southern support for his plans. And in order to get that support, he actually has to arrange to repeal the Missouri Compromise line out of the Louisiana Territory. He wants to get that. He basically takes away this line that had been keeping the peace in the United States for almost 3 decades now. And so really what we're looking at is, in order to get Southern congressmen to go along with his idea of developing these areas of the country, Kansas and eventually Nebraska, he needs to promise them that he will get rid of the Missouri Compromise line. And he's going to be able to do that largely by, he's looking at trying to run for president a little bit later in his political career. And he's hoping that by passing what's known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, this is going to launch him onto the national stage and really set him up for a presidential run. Now, what this act does is it repeals that Missouri Compromise line. So that imaginary line in Louisiana Territory, poof, goodbye. It's no longer in existence. This has a huge implication because it will allow slavery into the areas north of that line. But it goes a step further, and what Douglas does is he splits this entire region that was all just called unorganized territory into 2 separate territories, one called Kansas Territory and one called Nebraska Territory. Now, his idea, how he thinks of this in his head, is that Kansas should come in as a slave state. That territory should have slavery. It's right next to Missouri, which is a slave state, and then Nebraska, which is north of that, and that's right next to the free states. That should come in as a free state. Therefore, we still have this balance. No one should be all that upset by it. Now, both Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats absolutely are furious. They hate what Douglas has done here. They think this is a horrible blow to the abolitionist cause because that line that had stopped slavery from coming up northwards has now been gone. Basically, he's eliminated it. And that's been keeping the peace for a long time in the United States. Even moderate Northerners see this as an assault on abolition. But Douglas pushes forward with this act anyway, and he gets it passed in Congress. And so, in doing so, he deeply fractures the Democratic Party. The Northern and Southern Democrats no longer can agree with one another. They see 2 totally different things when they look at the same picture. And so what this ultimately does, kind of ironically, is he's hoping, I'm going to pass this law and everyone's going to think I've done a great job compromising between abolitionist and pro-slavery. But he doesn't do that at all. He absolutely kind of ruins his career. He invites this controversy in by repealing that Missouri Compromise line. And so this is going to weaken the party. The Whigs, they're going to completely break under this. Not a single Northern Whig in Senate or Congress would vote for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Southern Whigs, they're going to flee the Whig Party and go and join the Democrats down in the South. That will more firmly cement the South and the Democratic Party as being sort of bedfellows. The Democrats thus become the party of the slave-owning South. So, the death of the Whig Party shows this true ideological divide. It's no longer about political party. If we were to put it in the modern day context, it really wouldn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It matters whether you're from the North or the South. That's the biggest difference between people during this time period, is their regional affiliation. The act also is going to galvanize the North even further against slavery. They see this as a huge assault on abolition, and the repeal of that 3630 line through the Louisiana Territory is such a horrible travesty of justice to them that they are now going to basically put their efforts more into abolitionist causes. Anybody who is kind of a moderate, like, I don't like slavery, but what am I going to do about it? Or what do I really care? I got my own problems. Even they start to become more fervently anti-slavery. And so what we're seeing is the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act gives rise to two things: further regional separation between the North and the South, and the repeal of that 3630 line. Now, there's an even bigger outcome from all of this. And as you're moving through the slides with me, you can see kind of how that works on the map. Nebraska territory is way up in the north. Kansas territory is down right next to Missouri. And the idea is that Kansas will come in as a slave state, and Nebraska will come in as a free state if they choose to apply for statehood. But this opens up a much bigger issue in American history, and this is an issue known as the event of Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is the result of the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. After the country gets divided, this territory gets divided over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, if we go back and think about what we were just talking about a few slides back, popular sovereignty was going to be what decided the issue of slavery in these newly created territories. So despite the fact that Douglas goes, well, naturally, Nebraska will be free, Kansas will be slave state, then that's not how it's going to get decided. It's going to get decided by vote. And so what happens is both of these territories are now open to a vote on whether or not slavery will be illegal or illegal. And so both Northerners and Southerners, after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, start flooding into Kansas territory. This is going to be the epicenter. Whatever the vote there becomes of national importance. And so Northerners and Southerners flood into the territory trying to settle there to swing the vote for or against slavery. Now, this is going to lead to chaos and violence in the streets. It all starts when you have some very well-armed, excuse me, the allergies again. You have some very well-armed pro-slavery vigilantes are going to come in and attack the town of Lawrence, Kansas in 1854. Now, these pro-slavery vigilantes come in and they burn down the printing presses. They burn down the hotel. They basically sack the town because Lawrence is associated with Northerners and anti-slavery. Now, when anti-slavery advocates come to Lawrence in order to try and save it, it's too late. It's pretty much been burned to the ground. Among them is a very zealous guy by the name of John Brown. He's somebody we're going to be introduced to a little bit later on in our lectures, in our course here. But he comes back in and he sees this destruction that's happened in Lawrence, and he dedicates himself to fighting slavery. A little bit later on, Brown is going to stand up in the middle of the church that he goes to in Maryland, and he's going to say, I was told by God, God spoke to me, that it's my job to eliminate slavery from every inch of American soil with bloodshed. He's a white guy, and he's kind of an interesting figure. Most people in his time period, even abolitionists, thought he was a little nuts. But he says, God told me and me alone to go and kill every slave owner in the American South and free the slaves. And that's something he's going to attempt to do further on down the line. For our purposes here in Kansas, this whole event of Bleeding Kansas, the Brown rallies up a group of anti-slavery vigilantes. So that what we're having here is vigilante attacks back and forth in Kansas. He organizes a counterattack on the pro-slavery town of Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas. Now, as they start to lay siege to this town, just as the vigilantes had done in Lawrence, they actually are going to start pulling a bunch of people out of their houses. They actually dragged 5 guys out of their house, and they slaughter them in the streets with sabers and swords and knives. They have guns on them. Think about the level of rage and anger that this takes. They have a gun. You could just shoot the guy in the head and put him out of his misery. They actually mutilate and hack these guys to death in the street. And it shows you the level of violence that's starting to escalate around this issue of slavery. These attacks would set off an unprecedented back and forth of attacks and counterattacks. All of this craziness starts to break out in Kansas. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers are all pouring in, and they're attacking and killing each other. It's basically it's like the Wild West. It's chaos. And this is an event that the media at this time period dubs it Bleeding Kansas. And so this has often been labeled as sort of a quasi-civil war. This is really where we first see the outbreak of violence between anti-slavery and pro-slavery people right there in Kansas. They're literally killing each other in the streets. Franklin Pierce, the President of the United States, has to send in a new governor and 1,300 federal troops to try and keep the peace in Kansas territory. That'll settle things down for a while between about 1854 and 1857 when this all breaks out again. But what we see happening here is the North will respond to this event overwhelmingly. They start sending down money, weapons, and more settlers to try and shore up the vote against slavery in the territory. Now, on the other side, you have the South is going to be swinging things their own way. They start sending what they call border ruffians across the border of Kansas. These are legal citizens of Missouri. They have no intention of settling in Kansas. What they're going to do, Missouri's right next door. In fact, Kansas City, the city that is very popular for the Royals and the Chiefs and all that, they're split between Missouri. That city itself is on the border of Missouri and Kansas. But the border ruffians jump over from Missouri just long enough to vote in the election and swing it towards slavery. And so ultimately what they're going to do is start trying to swing the vote with illegal votes because these people are not going to stay in Kansas. They're going to go back home to Missouri. But ultimately, this is going to become a problem. And what's going to happen is that this will all start to sort of change into this national issue. What started as popular sovereignty, let's vote on the issue of slavery, became a national referendum on the issue of slavery. Even though you have people are furious about Douglas's removal of the 3630 line in the North, the South sees this as a great opportunity. Everyone knows that now it's all about voting in these new territories. It's all about popular sovereignty. And so everybody is going to start taking their own tactics to try and get people in there. We talked about the border ruffians. The North uses something called the Immigrant Aid Company. They start sending people down south, down to Kansas by the thousands. And so ultimately what happens is you're going to start to see that Kansas, it has enough people to make this vote, but they're totally still split because everybody moved down there to vote in opposite ends, either for or against slavery. Now, ultimately, what you have happening is Kansas will split. They form two different state governments. You have one in Lecompton, Kansas. This is made up of pro-slavery advocates. They are going to legalize slavery in Kansas in the spring of 1855. And the illegal voters who have jumped across from Missouri have swung the election in their favor. So they write a state constitution for Kansas and they say slavery will be legal here, and they apply for statehood in the U.S. On the flip side, you have an anti-slavery government in the rebuilt town of Lawrence, Kansas. They put together their own state government in Kansas, and they apply for statehood in the United States. And so now the issue has been pushed onto the national government. And there are two competing local governments or state governments there in Kansas. So this will become a very, very huge issue. And it's going to basically, the problem here is that you have a bicameral legislature. One of the houses is going to vote in favor of the Lecompton government and pro-slavery. The other one is going to vote in favor of the Lawrence government and anti-slavery. So the issue still hasn't been worked out, even though they've submitted for statehood. But that event of Bleeding Kansas is a really important one because it shows you the true division in the nation in the build-up to the Civil War. Now, this is a good place to sort of wrap up this mini lecture video. When I pick it back up, we're going to talk about violence on the floor of Congress and the fight between Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner, a guy we were introduced to way back when we were looking at segregation in the American cities. But that is where we'll pick it up in the next slides. Then we'll talk about the Dred Scott case, among a few other issues, westward expansion, and we'll wrap up our discussion with immigration and nativism in the next mini lecture video.